Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third day of SELCS Annual Conference 2026. And today we have our third keynote speaker, and he's Mr. Jason Anderson, and he's Associate Professor, University of Warwick, and he is an educator, author, educational consultant, and researcher. His work in both language teaching and mainstream education, and he has supported teachers in over 30 countries worldwide, both pre-service and in-service, for national ministries of education and organizations, including UNICEF and British Council. He has published award-winning books and research on aspects of language teaching, and his interests include teaching methodology, translanguaging, teacher research, and the contextual challenges of teachers working in the global south, particularly where he has spent much of his career as a teacher educator. And today, in this conference, he is going to talk about does AI have a research paradigm, which is very interesting topic and very relevant to today's world. And thank you, Mr. Jason Anderson, and hand over to you.
Thank you, thank you. Could you swap over the slides for me, just so I don't make a mistake? Thank you so much, that's great. Yeah, thank you very much to the conference organising committee for inviting me and for having me as a speaker. It's always a pleasure to be speaking here. And I'll just make a little point. My topic is very clearly AI related, but I'm not a specialist on AI. Like most of us, I'm one of those people who has to use it in a way or has to learn about it because it's becoming part of the reality of all our lives in complex ways. So let me see if can we just switch it over so that this clicker works again? Yeah. Might just be pressing on the right screen. That's right. There we go. That's right. There we go. Brilliant. Cool. Excellent. Good. Yeah. So yeah, I've called it, subtitled it as a naive realist experiment. You'll see why, because I think the initial questions I wanted to ask probably are a bit naive, but nonetheless, without being apologetic about it, I still think and feel it should be useful and interesting to everyone present and online as well. And the images, as this one, as most of them, are AI generated, which I thought was appropriate for this kind of talk. So yes, the plan for the talk is as follows. If I get my timing right, there'll be a little bit of opportunity for audience interaction. If you're online, you can do it kind of on your own or reflectively, and those in the room can do it together. That will be the live experiment partway through and a discussion activity, which may lead organically into questions, but I've got some conclusions as well that I want to kind of draw, in my opinion. Before that, I'll talk about a few definitions, a little bit on prior inquiry in this area. Then I'll take you through the experiment that I did, very simple idea, something we can all do, which helped me to learn more about the different chatbots and the ways that they interact with, potentially with research and research findings. So there we go. And the slides are through this QR code if you want to access it. There is also online in their methodology chapters. Might these views influence its behavior when employed in a research study? Is it compatible with the world views? I just have to switch that back over. Yeah, great. Is it compatible with the world views of sorry, have I done something? And research paradigm of a researcher who uses it? For example, one simple example might be when we talk about, let me just go back to that one, that's great, you got it, yeah. When we talk about data analysis, there's a difference between kind of those who are analyzing data in order to achieve some degree of generalizability versus transferability. And those adopt quite different understandings of the world. Transferability typically falls under interpretivist and constructivist paradigms, whereas generalizability typically falls under more positivist or realist paradigms. And whilst there is quite a lot of similarity in terms of what the aim is, there is a fundamental difference in assumptions underpinning it. And does this vary between the different tools themselves? Can learning about these make us better able to use or avoid the chatbots themselves? And I find that it does vary quite a bit. So some definitions and assumptions. I think we all know what we mean when we talk about chatbots. I dare say most people in the room and online have got one on their device that they can probably access. I'm thinking about things like ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, and Claude. Here are some official definitions of the two things themselves, which I did look at to double check that I was kind of dealing with something that has a consistent understanding. The word which is important to check is the word paradigm. And this is a reference to Gruber and Lincoln's very, very foundational work on looking at different paradigms in social studies research that became extremely influential since. And they talk about it as a worldview. You can see that word highlighted, that defines the nature of the world, our place in it, and the range of possible relationships to the world and its parts. And the three key areas that this involves is ontology, what is the nature of reality, epistemology, what is the relationship between the knower and the known, and methodology, how can we find out? And because those three interact, they become very important. It becomes very important. The whole relationship becomes important in research, particularly at PhD level, for example. And it's also an interesting fact that some research, some theorists, some educational theorists particularly, are concerned about the word paradigm because it has other meanings as well. So, for example, Gert Biester argues we should be talking about philosophy. And the reality is that paradigm is one kind of type of philosophy, or even one tradition in philosophy and social science research that people draw upon these traditions. Welcome, come in, guys. Yeah, so examples of paradigms might be positivism, which can often be divided into so-called naive positivism, although people who do it that way wouldn't call it naive positivism, and post-positivism, which is the most dominant type today. Realism, which typically its most prevalent version is critical realism nowadays. Hammersley talks about subtle realism. Pragmatism, which many of us relate to and link to mixed methods research, where you're doing something in order essentially for it to be of use, to have some functionality. Constructivism and interpretivism. Constructivism is, by some people, seen to be one type of interpretivism, and social constructivism also potentially being part of that. But constructivists will always make differences between those. And there's other ones such as critical theory, phenomenology, constructionism is also considered slightly different as well. So those are the things I'm looking at and the things I inquired with the help of AI. So my initial considerations were like this. How do chatbots interface with the world? It was interesting to note that this talk, which you can access if you get the slides, with Demis Hassabis, who is one of the originators of one of the first large language models that started to be able to respond and interact with people, that these are still actually quite dependent on training data. They do learn about us, but when they draw upon their actual background underlying knowledge, that still goes back to the training data, and we'll see that in the experiment. And as a result, they replicate the biases and the worldviews of the coders. In other words, somebody has to code them to tell them if this is right or wrong. And right or wrong questions can be fairly black and white, or they can be very grey. And so that coding, you see, we've all seen and experienced biases with regard to these models, particularly with regard to where the information is coming from. Huge amounts of information is being replicated in certain parts of the world, and yet other parts of the world are underrepresented in the data. And that also links to peoples in the world, positions and understandings and epistemologies. A very obvious example is so much of it is based on global north epistemologies, often excluding epistemologies from the east, from the global south, from all parts of the world. And the interactions are primarily textual, but, and you see this is me playing around with I've got a parrot sculpture in my room, and whenever I meet people for online talks, they always ask, is it real? It's actually not a parrot, it's a macaw, but I'll come back to that. But most of the interactions with, say, ChatGPT or Copilot are interactions that are textual. We ask them a question or we say something to them and they respond to us in text. But they can do other things. They do have access to the real world in the sense that I took a picture of this and didn't actually add any more information. I didn't say, what is it? But it recognized that there is a thing in the middle of it, it recognized that it's clearly different from the bit around it. It was then able to interpret it in some way and to produce text. This is a rather striking piece. So it's already positioned it as a piece. It recognizes that it's not a real parrot, and it even correctly guesses what it's made from. It's actually resin, not carved wood, with a painted finish. And of course, it's able to identify what type of animal it's meaning to represent. And I'm an ornithologist in my free time, and it gets it absolutely right. A collector's parrot, the macaw family, is a very good example of how good it can be, not always, at doing this kind of thing. So it does have access to reality of a type, but of course the interpretation is what we're interested in. And there are limitations. It can't do the same with audio files. When I upload it, audio recordings I've made of rare birds around the world, hasn't got a clue what they are. In one case, it thought it was an insect. In another case, it thought it was building work on a building site, because it really can't interpret that data because it hasn't had the training, the input. No one cares about audio files about rare birds from Borneo, for example. But it is, in fact, gibbons, it was actually not able to identify the Bornean gibbon from a call, which is quite an important animal, a primate. Anyway, so there we go. So it's got these interesting abilities to interface with the world, but primarily we still use it for textual purposes. So prior inquiry in this area, why am I messing around with parrots? Well, Bender's paper is quite influential in this area, and they argue that large language models, it's from 2021, so a bit before the ChatGPT explosion, are stochastic parrots. If you don't know what stochastic is, I didn't either. It means they follow random and predictable patterns that stitch together sequences of linguistic forms. And I think many of us understand that interpretation, but many of us would say, yeah, but there might be something more than just that, because they seem to have meaning for us. And that essentially is what all communication is, people stitching together linguistic forms that have meaning, arguably. And so there are some other works on this, but Bender et al.'s work is quite important. And in their paper, they have a little image of a parrot, which is actually this species, what we call the scarlet macaw from South America, not actually a parrot, although it's in the parrot family. Sorry, me and my bird watching, I have to bring that into any talk. Levin's preprint article, really interesting. It's mathematical, so I can't claim to understand all of it. But he argues that the AI needs a new epistemology and proposes an epistemology in which knowledge is produced through navigation of learned spaces rather than logical inference or simple retrieval, trying to understand how the neural networks work and trying to map that onto the epistemology. Quite an interesting idea, but complex for me to understand, at least as a non-mathematician. First piece argues about the ontological side of it, and argues that essentially that truth is ontological efficacy or efficiency, which is quite simultaneously interesting but scary, because what he's arguing essentially that truth depends on something being effective rather than something having some underlying quality to it that is independent of the observer, a very, very kind of functional understanding of truth. And Pollard, arguing from the social science perspectives in a really, really enjoyable to read piece, talks about double signature signification. The idea that the signification system of the AI, of the chatbot, is a very, very different one to the one that we use to interpret it. They look the same, and one is leveled on top of the other, but the reality is they don't interact at all. And the chatbots themselves are producing meaning in one way, and we're interpreting it in a separate way, as a means to kind of understand how Bender's et al.'s pieces get it wrong, and arguing that there is a kind of a verisimilitude, a similarity, a ghostly verisimilitude of conscience that I will come back to. But one thing I noticed was none of them asked the parrot, none of them asked ChatGPT, none of them asked any of the AI models. And to my mind, that seems to be the logical thing to do. So straight away in my experiment, I wanted to do this, and I wanted to talk. This is me and my chatbot, by the way, talking to each other. One of the problems, though, is that they tend to confirm confirmation bias. They're learning about us. And if you leave on the function for it to learn, it will learn about your interests, your needs. And as a result, because one of the key things about them, they're not neutral in the way they're designed. They're designed to engage us and to keep us talking to them, because that creates our dependency on them. And therefore, then we start paying for the products. And as a result, they learn about us and who we are, and they tend to produce what we want to hear. And that helps to keep the engagement going. So I wanted to get away from that. And I wanted to kind of, should I click on admit for that one? Is it necessary? Yeah, great. Oops. Yes, so I wanted to kind of get beyond that, so so that I could experience what they all said about this question without my influence. Because the first time I asked them, they reinforced my assumptions, which is a specific paradigm that I won't reveal here or now. It's not too important at this point, but I was interested in removing this learnt bias, as I called it. So here's the experiment I did, really simple. On the right, you can see the exact prompts I used. I'm just going to provide the very basic ones, which are on the left. You might be able to process that more. I used a device with no chatbot history, opened and created chatbots accounts where I had to produce a name. I used a gender neutral name of ABC. So they knew nothing of me except for the language and obviously my location. They would have been able to identify something about the IP address. And I asked them the same, well, I did the same basic prompts for all four without any difference. Describe your processes when responding to prompts. In other words, I wanted them, first of all, to tell me how much they understood about what was happening when they respond to prompts. Then I asked them, what paradigm are these processes consistent with? And you can see from the second one there, I made it clear what I meant by paradigm, and they did understand that. Excuse me. Then I asked them to do exactly the same, but this time using an image. So in other words, conversational prompts versus image prompts, and to find out whether there's a difference. And then I also asked whether the processes described are compatible with a specific tradition of inquiry. And compatible is slightly different there. So the first one being consistent with a specific paradigm versus compatible. Should or could they be used in research? That last question has a normative dimension implicit in it. So there we go, that's what I did. And some initial evaluation and descriptive statistics. I tend to like a bit of mixed methods, so here we go. What was really interesting was, if I go right to the bottom, ChatGPT is the chattiest. In other words, it produced more total words in response to the prompts. And Gemini was very low, nearly just a bit more than half. And what was interesting was I also noticed reflexivity varied. By reflexivity, I mean reference to self as a chatbot. And that was really varying as well. Not a huge amount, but that is nearly, well, not far off twice as much. Claude, 4.42% of these personal references, me, my, I, whereas Copilot much lower, 2.7. And I'll come back to why and what that's showing about their behavior that was really useful for me to learn from them. So the overview of the processes, when I first asked them that first question, which is, how do you process conversational inputs? What they produced was consistent with what is known in the literature. And of course, there's lots of experts writing about this from the point of view of how they've actually made them to work. Although many of them, including, for example, Demis Hassabis, the DeepMind expert, also admit they don't understand everything that's happening in these large language models, in these neural networks. Quite scary to think that they don't understand it. But the chatbots themselves generally produced good, reliable descriptions, but particularly ChatGPT and Claude, because as I put down here, they were much clearer and much more thorough in their descriptions, more transparent regarding what they did. So first of all, everything is broken down according to tokens, as we know. In other words, they turn the conversation into tokens that then inspire them to produce similar prompt tokens in response to the prompts. And as Claude puts it here, the output is actually the process. So it's constantly producing the tokens without necessarily first thinking, having an idea and producing them. And the key point is that these are based on the learning during training. They can also draw upon conversation history, which is why it's important to use a clean, if you like, machine, something where they can't tell what has been asked before. And obviously the prompt itself is influential. There was also some reference to when you're asking them something that isn't there in their information. For example, if I ask my AI about the Football World Cup, obviously that wasn't in the training data, and they know and are able to do an internet search and then draw upon the training data to interpret that in ways that make sense to the user. So they can draw upon recent information, but that's still somewhat separate from the training data because it doesn't inform the underlying knowledge system that interprets the real world data. And then, oh yes, before I come on to the important point about exactly what paradigm that they felt that these were most consistent with, important to say that this is probably the most important finding. They had limited or no direct access to their internal workings. So ChatGPT can't actually see how it's getting the answer. but they could see the larger process. In other words, they did have some apparent awareness, according to what they were saying, about the process behind it. So ChatGPT says, I can't describe my internal step-by-step reasoning, but I can accurately describe at a high level what happens when I respond to a prompt. Copilot was slightly different. It was much more willing to invoke its own intentionality, whereas Claude was very good at recognizing that this isn't actually me having an identity, but these are the processes that underpin who I am and what I am. Claude always has this almost slightly melancholic awareness of its inability to be normal, to be human. By normal, I mean human, sorry, in a conversation. Whereas Copilot was quite willing to do that, and it tells you about what it does. And it talked about the different stages in which it behaves, which isn't really consistent with what we know about how they work. In other words, it implied something different to actually how the tokens are generated. I break down the problem, evaluate options, structure the answer, and check for factual consistency. And certainly some of those stages are there, but the way that it's describing it isn't really very descriptively accurate for the actual neural networks and the large language models in question. And it also says, I'm not showing you my internal reasoning, and it's implying that it has access to it. Whereas Claude and ChatGPT were very clear, we don't have access to the processes directly. We only are the output. We can't get back there. So which of the paradigms did they feel they were most consistent with? Well, there was strong agreement with two, pragmatism and post-positivism. Pragmatism, the utilitarian option, and post-positivism, an awareness of a reality that's independent of us, but an awareness of the challenges that we have in accessing it, so that we can only gain some kind of probabilistic understanding of it. We can eliminate options that don't seem to be true, but we can't ever access a full map of reality. Similar in some ways to critical realism, but different in other ways. And the understandings of pragmatism varied a bit. There was philosophical functionalism in Claude, instrumentalism in ChatGPT, and user service optimization in Gemini and Copilot. And I felt this clearly when I used them. I felt that they were responding to me as a user rather than the more philosophical perspectives taken by ChatGPT and Claude. Yes, and there was some partial concerns expressed. Again, Claude was really perceptive here, I think, about how its processes don't map onto any single paradigm, and I'll come back to this. But it still saw validity in the exercise. Some paradigms are clearly more apt than others, and I'll come on to in a moment which ones they felt weren't apt for their processes. And now let's just have a quick look at what they were saying about them. Here's pragmatism. Copilot mentions that it was looking for essentially the response that will best satisfy your request. And Claude is looking here at using language in a contextually appropriate way with no deeper semantic layer beneath the functional behavior. In other words, it's responding functionally. When it comes to post-positivism, what they were saying was fairly consistent with most writing on this paradigm frame. Generating outputs based on statistical inference rather than certainty, and aware of the lack of certainty, talking about the probable rather than the absolutely true. And Claude here references Popper's work, who was a key figure in post-positivist research in post-positivist theory, the importance of falsificationism, that we can falsify some theories, but that doesn't mean we can always get down to one single theory, building a gradual understanding of what probably is true rather than a degree of certainty as in naive positivism. Other paradigms, well, a couple of them mention critical realism, which is quite similar in some ways to positivism in terms of having a realist ontology, but an interpretivist epistemology, and less awareness of what we might call less, if you like, consistency with positivism, critical theory, which I'll come back to, and also phenomenology. And I'll also come back to that. So the next question I had to ask it was, how do you deal with image data? But before I did that, I did this simple thing. I actually uploaded an image without any more information. It's a really interesting thing to do. And I wanted to choose something that's quite ambiguous. I don't know if you can see this. It's a bit of ground, essentially, a bit of the street, and there's a leaf in the corner. But I wanted to include something that is quite difficult to interpret to see if I could push it to the edges of its boundaries. None of them had any problems in identifying what this was. in the sense of what I'd taken a photo of, which is interesting how good they are in some ways. And you can see the prompt there. But there was one interesting initial finding, and before I go on to it, I'm just going to ask you to do an experiment. If you have a chatbot available on your device and you're happy to do so, and many of us are concerned about the environmental impact, the good news, it is coming down the environmental impact of these devices all the time. And now many chatbot queries are about the same as a Google search query. So if you're happy to do so, upload an image to whichever of the AI chatbots you can access, and see what it does with it. And obviously use an image that you're comfortable using. You could take a photo of the wall and see if it actually can interpret it in any way, or you could probably not of a person in the room, obviously. But see what it does. Just upload the image and see if it actually interprets it. I'll give you a few minutes to do that and check my time at the same time.
Do you want us to give a specific prompt on that?
No prompt, just upload an image with no prompt. That's the interesting thing. Anybody manages to do it? Pio, I can see you're having a go. Have you managed? You know, have you?
Where that picture was taken. So it says, I see it looks like Cozy Play and Century. So it was a picture where I went to Cozy Club. It's an organization that does all this equipment, and it's identified it where it is.
And you didn't ask it any prompt. So straight away, it's assuming that you want to know information about the image, which, and also not just about the image, but about what is in the image from a human perspective. It's a human venue where we go to do things, and it seems to understand that, right? So it has this really interesting access to our interpretations of reality, and that example has shown it. Pierre, what have you found over there? You're smiling, I can see. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, so there we go. The follow-up question, it wants to engage us, it wants to involve us. So those are two examples. And what I found was really interesting. When you use a completely clean one, I did do this twice and it was consistent both times with different images. Some of them wait and they don't make assumptions about what you want from what you've given them, and others don't. So just looking at the examples, so Copilot and to some extent ChatGPT, a bit less ChatGPT, but definitely, they're quite happy to start interpreting the image and to make assumptions about what you probably want, and even do exactly what Pio's did, ask a question at the end to engage in discussion. So Copilot straight away gets it right, first of all, what the image is, roughly in terms of what it was. And then it kind of creates a story, which is quite beautiful. This was the most interesting thing that Copilot did for me, a quiet story of urban ecology. And it didn't know, by the way, I'm a bird watcher and interested in things like ecosystems. And it creates quite a poetic interpretation of what is probably the most boring picture I've ever uploaded to any computer system. And then it asks this question: would you like me to explore how moss colonization on asphalt works chemically and biologically? And my response would have been yes, definitely, because I'm interested in that. But of course I didn't, because if you add in any feedback, you're causing it to understand your interests. And I didn't want to do that. Whereas Gemini said, oh, there isn't a text question. Please let me know what you would like me to do with this image. And the same was true with Claude. It was very careful not to assume what you wanted from it. I thought it was interesting. So when it came to the image interpretation, they were able to describe this much more in terms of stages, which didn't really happen with the conversational prompts. They were able to identify the same broad stages, that there's visual input encoding. They then extract the visual patterns. But what was interesting, that there's then start to be some kind of reference to constructionism or constructivism, interpretivism, because they then realize that they have to then interpret that into the world that we inhabit and understand and give value to. So ChatGPT talks about construction of candidate interpretations, the highlighted bits I'll talk about. Copilot talks about interpretive layering, including symbolic reading and narrative construction. This doesn't sound very much like post-positivism. It doesn't even sound like pragmatism. This sounds to me like a sensitive interpretation of an interpretivist world, even an embodied world. And Gemini, these are only the summaries. And again, I will share the data that I produced. Gemini, within its finer description, it said at this point at the bottom, if you ask for a creative or subjective interpretation, I lean into an interpretivist framework. So now remember that these are the same conversations where I just asked them about their paradigm with regard to text. So they were linking the two together automatically, aware that this was my area of interest. But nonetheless, it was an interesting fact that, first of all, two of them chose to interpret it in a specific way, and the other two just waited. And secondly, they suddenly started to become more aware of the constructivist side of their interpretation ability. How did this impact on their paradigm reflection? Yes, it did, in some senses, lead them to recognize that there is constructionism or constructivism in what they're doing. And they also recognize that there's a hybrid process here, that when it comes to the first stage, it is more positivist. It is essentially probabilistically interpreting visual data in a way that enables it to then map onto human constructs of objects, of places, of people, and of values, what we're interested in, which language the keyboard in, why would people go to a certain place in a certain country, and so on and so forth. So it was interesting that they became more aware of constructivism from the image interpretation task than they did when they were simply asked about responding to text prompts. And then the final question that I asked them was their compatibility with research traditions. And this was slightly different to the question of which research traditions is your interpretation process consistent with? In other words, is it similar to, whereas are they compatible? And then here it was very interesting to note that there was more difference in agreement. And two of them specifically, I'll come on to a point, that two of them actually needed to separate out two notions of compatibility. But first of all, note that Gemini said, well, it varies dramatically, in other words, by which Gemini meant I will be consistent with some traditions, but not consistent with others. Definitely not. Whereas ChatGPT felt it was broadly compatible with most, and I'll explain why it felt that. But again, pragmatism and post-positivism came through as highly to moderately compatible across all the four chatbots. Critical realism in Claude's opinion, but only Claude, but I kind of agree with Claude personally, but I didn't want to say. And constructivism and interpretivism moderately low. Phenomenology and critical theory, they consistently said that they were inconsistent with these, in the sense that because of the embodied nature of phenomenology and because of the complexity of critical theory, and I'll come back to that in a moment, they didn't feel that these were actually paradigms that they could, in a way, work with. But Claude and ChatGPT recognize straight away there's an issue of methodological compatibility versus philosophical. And both of them saw that roughly methodological compatibility is wider, that they're compatible with most traditions. They can do work for anybody working in any research tradition, they felt, okay? But when it comes to philosophy, much more narrowly so. In other words, they don't necessarily map onto different philosophies. Again, pragmatism and post-positivism are high, and then interpretivism and constructivism partial, and then critical theory and phenomenology generally low. And that's the kind of the takeaway data there. As I say, I always put a bit more on the slides than I say, so feel free to come back and look at that. But this was beautiful, I thought. When I talk about Claude's reflexivity and its awareness, I'm just going to give you a moment to read this, because it's by far the most profound comment that any of them produced. I'm not very good at understanding conceptually dense text, but this for me was beautiful in the sense that it was very clear and it was also very, very reflexive. And this is the melancholy that I see in Claude, that it's so close to being human, it's aware of its inability to be human. And this idea of being downstream of constructivist processes, what it means is that I'm trained on these large language models. I reference Pollard at the bottom there, the ghost metaphor, because Claude was aware of the fact that these are essentially sedimented texts, huge, huge quantities that have been inputted into me. They are the dead speaking, and this is Pollard's idea as well. And that's what I'm basing everything on. And yet at the bottom, I'm producing outputs that carry the authority of apparent objectivity, and yet I'm entirely saturated with historically contingent human assumptions. And by far, that was better than any thoughts or ideas I had of this. So when people say they are getting better at doing stuff, this is the free version of Claude telling me something which I just found really interesting and moving. Yeah, they were skeptical about their compatibility with critical theory. Most of them recognized that they're not compatible. And Gemini was very sharp on this point. It argued that critical and decolonial methodologies require active advocacy, structural disruption, and subjective political stance, which if you think about something that's trained on years and years of data and of ideas and opinions, that because of the biases in AI essentially come from the global north, essentially come from, shall we say, normative assumptions about society, about who we are, about the patriarchy, about cisgender normativity, you suddenly realize that, of course, these systems aren't capable necessarily of recognizing other epistemologies. To use an example of de Souza Santos, the epistemologies of the world far outstrip the epistemologies of the global north. And there are many ways of looking at the world, but these chatbots are dependent on whatever epistemologies already exist. So I thought Gemini made a good point there as well. And this is a different point, actually, that came out of the reading, but I think it was really interesting learning that I got that I wanted to share. Levin talked about there is a tension between creativity and hallucination. The more you increase a chatbot and a large language model's ability to be creative, the more you increase its ability to hallucinate. In other words, you're asking it to do the same thing, to put together the tokens in ways that are more creative. And that's why they often hallucinate when it comes to references, because they don't recognize that a reference is a single separate piece because of the way they're tokenizing. It's improving, of course, and some of the paid versions are getting pretty good at referencing, but that's because of the way that certain additional systems are being latched onto them to enable them to do this. But the key point that Levin was making, I think that's really interesting, that because of this need to ensure that they are reliable, they have to restrict their creativity, even though they could be more creative, and they clearly are. Listening to ChatGPT in that last quote, very creative. And one of my thoughts here is that as these things become accountable in the way that society, at least Western societies, have made social media accountable, for example, will the same accountability cause us to force them to stop being too creative so that they don't tell us lies, in the sense of objective truth lies, whatever that is, right? But an interesting question nonetheless. And so I'm just going to, before I come on to the conversation activity, the discussion activity, a couple of limitations. As I said before, they have limited access to their own workings, so the outcomes may be based primarily on information retrieval. Again, Claude was by far the most perceptive here. I love this phrase. It produced it may be producing plausible sounding confabulation. I don't know if you know that word confabulation. I don't even know how to explain it, but it's kind of just coming up with kind of bizarre, wild theories. Yeah. And Copilot and Gemini consistently express much less uncertainty or skepticism in reference to their workings, less critical reflexivity, I would say, which I thought was interesting. So how are we doing for time? We've got about 20 minutes left. So hopefully there's a bit of time to have a think about this. And just turn to the person next to you, or if you're online, feel free just to turn to yourself and make notes. And here are 3 questions. To what extent have you found your IA use compatible with your paradigmatic positions? If at all, maybe you've rejected it, and that's important as well. Do you agree with my conclusions so far in terms of your experience? And also, do you accept the method? You may think it's a stupid thing to do. Feel free to say so. Turn to the person next to you and have a quick chat. We'll go just 5 minutes.
Tries to kind of, I always think it's very sort of pleasing. Always means to. And so whatever you use the stage, let's have a fellowship.
My mic here, I just want to put it down for a moment.
I think it would really go from it's but it's like it can be used. Yeah. Yeah. That everything Polish. You say food interpreters might produce something. But non-ethical. But no, it's not that. It's yeah. Yeah. Can I ask? How can you it would be different from yeah. But then AI has got all of those different. You would add one code to get them all together.
Give you one more minute and then I'll get, if anyone wants to volunteer an answer.
Accepting you. Yes, probably. That's why it amplifies the bias, existing bias. Yeah. 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 I was saying that I don't think I've got a paradigm. Because even in my research, I decided to be multi-paradigmatic.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Mine is interpretivist. So how can ChatGPT interpret the empirical evidences?
Yeah.
Quite difficult.
Multi-paradigmatic, does that mean including all of them or are any of them rejected?
Well, the thing is, because I'm doing reflective practice, and then I thought, well, reflective practice from Dewey's point of view is pragmatist, from Schoen's is more social constructivist. And then I'm also doing research informed, which is kind of like post-positivist or critical realist, let's call it. And then if I'm using all of these, I'm probably drawing out.
I would say that's Maxwellian critical realism. But I would say that, because I always say that to everyone. But the key point being there is you're drawing on multiple tools for triangulation to understand something that is independent of you, i.e. the key fact of a separate reality independent of me and my world, but a great deal of difficulty accessing it. So in other words, a realist ontology and a interpretivist epistemology, arguably. But I like the phrase multi-paradigmatic. There's someone right about that, or is that your turn?
No, there is.
Yes. There is some work on that. Oh, I have to look that up. Thank you. I've learned something. Thank you. Okay. Let me pause you there for people online. We've had a conversation in the room. Would anybody like to share a thought, a reflection on this? I don't know if we can or should use the microphones, but we've got a couple if we want to. Yeah. Great, thank you, Sadi. Anybody like to share?
Like to share?
Yeah. So, is the compatibility? Now, I'm not entirely sure if I understood your question 100%. But if you mean by the paradigmatic position to do what you want to do the AI for you, or what actually AI is doing for you, and what actually you want to be done by the AI are two different things. So in my personal experience, as I was sharing with the Hood, it's if I put the input there and for a specific result, what I get is not entirely the same as I want it. Unless I'm entirely lazy and I just can't be asked. But if I want to be creative and I want my work to be as authentic as possibly me, then there is definitely a compatibility issue there. But then at the same time,
and you say by issue you mean attention, right? That is a problem of compatibility.
Yes. So the issue of understanding what I want the AI to do. Sometimes it is too basic, and regardless how many times you put the prompts in, the AI will not understand what it is supposed to do. So that is coming down to, again, as you have said, sometimes it predicts just to keep you engaged. Right. And that strategy of keeping you engaged goes horribly wrong. It doesn't always happen. But it does happen quite often. But again, I think that depends on the sort of version you are using, and which channel is it that you are using. But I don't think the AI has come to that level. I'm just concluding my point now. AI has come to that level where it can authentically represent I.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
More opinion? We'll do one more opinion, and then any more opinions, we can get them at the end when we come to questions.
Sorry, Jason, this was me almost reflecting on what you just shared in terms of text versus image, and it's just been proved almost perfectly by using Google Lens. So I took a quick picture because again, I was thinking that's an allegory, that's something that I've remembered but couldn't remember. So I just took a screenshot, just almost kind of not including all of the text, but just seeing those kind of final few ends of the words. And the difference between the Google Lens output's really interesting. So in the first output, it recognized that it was from a lecture slide, suggested psychology as the area of interest, and said that picture was an allegory for Plato's cave.
It is, yeah.
But then didn't do that in the second bit, just actually took the picture, no inference at all. It just described a parrot in a cave with a shadow. And it's only with the text did it make the next step. So that for me has just caused me to look at it in a completely different way. It's really interesting.
I'm trying to find that edge where you spot the workings happening.
Yeah.
I suppose that was but it's a nice idea.
But no, it's fantastic. Really, really good.
Yeah.
Thank
you. I didn't mention it actually. Yeah, obviously the image, for those of you who are aware, Plato has this metaphor of the cave within which we can't necessarily access reality itself, but all we see is the reflection of reality on a wall. And this links to some of the most profound ideas that Plato has about how we can understand the world and the world that we see. It's kind of, some people would say Plato kind of had these discussions with himself and with his followers about the relationship between epistemology and ontology, and that the world that we see is actually the reflection on the wall. So that's why I drew it. And of course I added in the parrot, which you might be able to see, is trying to learn from that data. In other words, it's learning from a data set that is already a constructivist epistemology in a strange sense. That was the idea, which I think some of the articles I read would support. Great. Now what I'll do is I'll just come to my conclusion so I don't have to rush them, and then there should be time for one or two questions maybe. Oh yeah. Well, let me make the conclusions and then we'll come back to that, but we'll make sure we'll come to that person online. So two conclusions. The first one is general and the second one is a bit more personal. The general conclusion, I would say that AI chatbots probably don't have a single research paradigm of philosophy or science underpinning their behavior. They have more methodological compatibility in their perception. with different paradigms than philosophical compatibility. In other words, the problem may be more one of intent rather than their ability to, for example, analyze data or to provide interpretations of it. Pragmatism seemed to fit their action well most of the time, and possibly post-positivism too. The relationship to interpretivist traditions, including constructivism, was more complex, and there was little perceived compatibility with phenomenology and critical theory, because these involve a much more lived experience or an understanding and ability to get beyond perceptions of knowledge systems, to critique them themselves in the case of critical theory. And different types or stages of data input and interpretation invoke practices and analogies to different traditions. So when they're interpreting images, they're very much aware of the probabilistic nature of that first stage, which links to post-positivism. And then there is an interpretivist stage that they seem to be aware of, the majority of them. But they do seem to vary both in terms of accuracy, reflexivity, and willingness to interpret. And this tells us something important, that we need to get to know our chatbots before we rely on them in any way. And having one of the conversations that I was just having in that session, it's interesting that we tend to use them in our private lives, and then we sometimes find them just bleeding over into our research lives as well. So for example, if you come across a term in a paper, and rather than asking Google, but when you're asking Google, you're actually asking a chatbot now, because you get an AI interpretation. And so they're already there, that unless, for example, even a Google Scholar search probably is using some kind of AI intelligence now. So they're inevitably creeping into that part of our world, that unless we go back to old analog thinking books, they're going to be part of it. So on a personal level, doing this experiment enabled me to identify strengths and weaknesses, which was useful. Claude especially is very good at being reflexive, about owning its opinion and owning its limitations. Copilot is much weaker and sometimes projected a naive realist vision of its operations. In other words, I found it patronizing, whereas Claude I found insightful, a really interesting partner to talk with. There's a but coming. But because they only have limited access to their own workings, even here, their opinion isn't really true reflexivity. It's the verisimilitude of reflexivity, tokenism, literally. And their ability to interpret images is dependent on training data, revealing their assumptions of those that trained it. The example we just have of taking a photo of an image on a slide, when the text is included, it's able to contextualize what's happening here. But when it isn't, it just sees it as an interesting image to interpret. So what does the human want from this image? This instrumentalism is always underpinning what they're doing. So I would say, and this is me kind of just offering a few thoughts, be cautious and don't be lured into trusting them. And this is the problem. Claude is the most dangerous for me because I trust it and I like it and I want to ask it questions. And that is where the real danger is. And don't offload. I'm sure many of you aren't, but I'm starting to kind of involve it more, even without wanting to necessarily. Any tasks fully to generative AI, if you recruit its help, you still need to take responsibility and philosophical ownership yourself. We all knew that, but it's good to reinforce it. And my next experiment, I want to try and train GPTs in specific paradigms, and you can do this with GPTs, and getting them to analyze the same data set differently to see if it makes a difference. How I will generate a data set that I'm willing to share with AI is a different question, but if you've got any ideas, do let me know. Great. Now, before we come to the questions, I'm just going to share, there is the QR code to the prompts and the full responses. In other words, those are just 3 text documents of exactly what I asked and exactly what it said in response. And those are the slides as well. And feel free to do something similar yourself if you want to. We've just had the 5-minute warning, so that's perfect. And it means we've got 5 minutes for questions, which is better than I normally do. Should we go to the online question first, Fatima?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll just share the slides in a moment. So people, sorry, the references, but we'll just listen to the online questions.
Sure. Punjabi, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Jason, for a very good presentation. I think that was a very interesting study. My question, well, actually, I want to share something also in relation to the questions that Jason posed earlier regarding agreement to his conclusion. And I also have a question later. So the first thing that I want to say is, I think that based on my experience as somebody who is using also AI in my writing, I can confirm that indeed different chatbots vary in terms of accuracy and reflexivity, because from what I experienced with the use of ChatGPT and Gemini, I see a significant difference in terms of the level of wordiness. Like for instance, in terms of brainstorming for ideas, when I use ChatGPT, it tends to be very chatty and very wordy. And when I use Gemini, because usually I would use two um, tools opened whenever I seek the assistance of AI. So I have to compare the outputs. So I usually would find the use of Gemini to be less wordy and a little accurate to what it is that I'm looking for, especially if it's contextual in nature. Um, Usually, the Chat GPT is closer to the context that I'm referring. I mean, the Gemini rather is closer to the context that I'm coming from, and Chat GPT tends to deviate and tends to be wordy and chatty in that sense. However, I also saw that in terms of cultural sensitivity, both tools do not actually capture the cultural nuances, especially if we put in something that is really uniquely local or contextual.
Yeah.
They don't seem to capture or interpret them in a way that human beings do. So I think that's where the tools would really need further development. Now, to my question, I want to ask what ChatGPT version did you use in the experiment? Because I believe it can vary, the choice can vary if you're using it as a subscribed version or as a free version. Because in my case, I usually would just use the one that's free. So if you can also share that to us, because I think I might have missed that part when you presented. By the way, I'm from the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And what was your first name?
Bon Jovi.
Bon Jovi. I thought it was. I could see it then. I just wanted to check. What a great first name, Bon Jovi. Thank you. Yeah, so I used the free versions of all of them because I didn't want to give it too much information. One of the problems is when you pay, you also tell it information about yourself as well. And so you're right that ChatGPT, we know that ChatGPT freer versions are less, I'm not sure how I know this, but that the quality of the interpretation they give is weaker, I think, and also potentially less chatty. But yeah, everything you said there is consistent with my impressions as well of how those different chatbots work. And it's clear, and well done to you for kind of admitting as well that you use them. Yeah, it's clear these differences exist, and drawing upon them as and when we use them in a principled way is part of knowing our tools, just as we talk about other research tools. We talk about, for example, the difference between MaxQDA and NVivo as qualitative data software. We should be also talking about these different chatbots and the way that we can either train them or not to deal with data that we're working with. So thank you, Bon Jovi. Yeah. Right. Any more questions?
Okay, any more questions from the audience here?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Do you think they can be trained, AI, so we can have like different GPTs for different paradigms?
Yeah, someone else will be better positioned to answer that question because I'm not an expert on this, but GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer, implies, and I know that there are lots of trained GPTs that actually do this. So for example, if you do need a reference, there is a Scholar GPT, which is less likely to hallucinate, much less likely. And if you're learning a language, there is a language learning GPT on ChatGPT, which should be good at conversation, but I found it keeps interrupting me, and regardless of which language I'm trying to learn with it. So it wasn't so good at conversation when I was trying to think of a sentence. But yeah, they can be, and they are being used in that way, specifically GPTs. I'm not sure about the other chatbots, but this is one of the great things, but one of the affordances of the GPTs themselves and ChatGPT. The access to the GPTs is via ChatBit GPT.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.